Good evening and welcome to the third and final webinar on Jewish Studies Today. I'm Tirosh-Samuelson and I'm the Regents Professor of History, Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism, and the Director of Jewish Studies at Arizona State University. As we have noted in the introduction to the previous two webinars, Jewish Studies at ASU is a unique hybrid of an academic program and a research center. We serve as an intellectual resource for all aspects of the Jewish experience through the ages, covering the diverse dimensions of the Jewish experience as it has evolved over time. Through undergraduate and graduate courses, research conferences, public lectures, and exhibits, Jewish Studies at ASU fosters critical inquiry about the past and an invitation to be engaged in the study of the present. We believe that knowledge about Jewish culture is crucial to flourishing Jewish life in the 21st century and to constructive relations between Jews and non-Jews. Our programs contribute to the quality of Jewish life in metropolitan Phoenix, and they enhance Jewish studies around the world. During this academic year, that's 2020 to 2021, we have offered all our public programs virtually because of the COVID-19 pandemic. If you participated in our previous activities, you know that we try to offer very informative programs to a very large audience of people. Communicating by Zoom indeed has enabled us to broaden our public outreach locally, nationally, and internationally. So the series of these three webinars on Jewish Studies Today was designed to accomplish three goals. First, to provide knowledge about the discipline of Jewish studies. Second, to introduce our faculty of Jewish Studies at ASU. And third, to familiarize all of us with new directions and new perspectives in the discipline of Jewish studies. Let me remind all of us that Jewish studies is not a new discipline. It was created or it came into existence in the 1820s in Germany. And in the beginning, the academic study of Judaism was part and parcel of the Jewish struggle for emancipation. That is to say, emancipation from legal and economic disabilities, social marginalization and exclusion, periodic violence and persecution. The struggle for emancipation lasted for about a century, at least in the West, roughly from 1789, the French Revolution, all the way to the unification of Germany in 1870. But it was really a very uneven and incomplete process. And in the eastern part of Europe, the full emancipation came much later, really with the Russian Revolution of 1917. The emergence of Jewish studies as an academic discipline signified the demand for inclusion of Jews in society and culture on the assumption that Jews are not different from non-Jews and that the Jewish past should be understood with the same academic tools that were applied to any other topic. To study Judaism academically or scientifically meant that the Jewish past must be studied historically and philologically in a disinterested and objective way. Judaism became a subject of scientific interrogation, and that included also the interrogation of Jewish canonic texts, whether it's the Bible, the Mishnah, the Talmud, rabbinic midrashim, and of course, other texts, including Kabbalistic texts about which I spoke last time. But if you're looking at those texts critically and historically, can you still take them as divinely revealed or divinely inspired text? And that question was the key issue in the 19th century, and at least I would say the first half of the 20th century. But today, we're not so concerned of these issues. We're concerned about other issues, maybe even more troubling or more challenging. Why should we care about Jewish studies? To whom do Jewish studies matter? What are the new ways or new methods that scholars of Jewish studies employ in order to interpret the Jewish past? And can the social sciences shed new light on the Jewish experience through the ages? So the three webinars were arranged chronologically. The webinar on April 6th focused on ancient Judaism. The one last week, April 13, focused on the Middle Ages and the early modern period. And today we're going to focus on the modern and contemporary Jewish experience. And we have three professors from ASU, all associated with the Jewish Studies program and the Center for Jewish Studies, and they all hold positions in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies at ASU. Our first speaker will be Professor Anna Cichopek-Gajraj. She is a native of Krakow, Poland. She earned her MA from the Jagiellonian University in Krakow and her PhD from the University of Michigan. She's an associate professor who focuses on East European Jewish history, and she's the author of two books on post-war Polish Jewish history. Her first book, Pogroms of Jews in Krakow, August 11th, 1945, was published in 2000. It was based on her award-winning MA thesis, and it was published by the Jewish Historical Institute. It was published, of course, in Polish in 2000. Her more recent book, Beyond Violence, Jewish Survivors in Poland and Slovakia in 1944-1948, that's a comparative social history of survivors and the effort to rebuild their lives in Poland and Slovakia after the Second World War. This book received the Jordan Schnitzer Book Award. It was a finalist in that competition, which is given by the Association for Jewish Studies. It also received the Barbara Held Prize, received an honorable mention there from the Association for Women in Slavic Studies. Professor Cichopek-Gajraj is also a proud recipient of the 2016 Shofar Zachor Award that is given by the Phoenix Holocaust Survivors Association. And it was given, and now I'm quoting, it was given to her for exhibiting and carrying the world of Holocaust education, Holocaust remembrance, and community interaction. She has served as director for Poland for John J. Hartman Nonprofit Foundation of Remembrance and Reconciliation for the Restoration of Jewish Heritage in Poland. And she received numerous grants and fellowships from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, from YIVO Institute, and the Memorial Foundation of Jewish Culture in New York. So she's going to focus on new directions in East European Jewish history. Our second speaker is Professor Volker Benkert. He's an assistant professor also in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. His PhD is from Potsdam University in Germany, and he focuses on the impact of sudden regime change on biographies after both totalitarian regimes in 20th century Germany. He's the author of the book, The Last Children of Socialism, Biographies of East Germans Born Around 1917, that came out in 2017. He's the editor of two more volumes on German generations and on German-American relations. His recent work focuses on how historical memory shapes places and their use today. He is the editor of a forthcoming book from Purdue University Press under the title Terror Times, Terrorscapes. That's the main title, and the subtitle is Temporal, Spatial, and Memory Communities of War and Genocide in 20th Century Europe. Locally, he explores a very interesting building known as Beth Hebrew. It was a synagogue, a community here in Phoenix, which was built after World War II, and it has a fascinating history. This is a project that involves several other members of the ASU community. Today, he's going to speak about contemporary Jewish spaces in Germany. And our third speaker is Professor Stanley Mervis. He's an assistant professor of history also in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. Professor Mervis is also the Harold and Jean Grossman Chair for Jewish Studies. His research focuses on social history of Jews in the early modern Atlantic, namely what is known as the Western Sephardic diaspora, and he deals primarily with issues of diasporic and Creole identity. He is the co-author of Jewish Treasures of the Caribbean And many of you probably saw that exhibit at the Cutler Plotkin Museum of Jewish Heritage. It's a fascinating story, and we had the joy of actually seeing a lot of the pictures from the Caribbean. And he wrote the essays about those places. He's also the co-editor of a volume called From Catalonia to the Caribbean, the Sephardic Orbit from Medieval to Modern Times. That's a collection of essays in honor of Professor Jane Gerber, who was his doctoral advisor. And most recently, in 2020, he published a monograph under the title The Jews of 18th Century Jamaica, a testamentary history of a diaspora in transition. That was published by Yale University Press in 2020, and also a fascinating story that really fleshes out this complex issue of what he calls Creole identities, merged identities. So Professor Mirvis offers us a social history of hundreds of last will and testaments exploring the relationship between colonial and metropolitan Jews and the nature of Jewish creolization in the British West Indies. And he will focus on new research on relations between Jews and Blacks in America. So without further ado, we are going to start with Professor Chihope Gajraj. I will turn off my video and I will mute myself. And when she's done, then we will move to Professor Bankert. So Professor Chihope Gajraj, this stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Let me share my screen. I hope that will work. Okay. This is a great pleasure to be here, and I'm going to talk, as Professor Samuelson mentioned, I'm going to introduce new directions in East European studies. And I would like to frame those new directions within a Baronian thought, or thinking a lot about Salo Baron and his view of Jewish history. So here you can see Salo Baron is very important for us. His daughter is a member of our community, Shoshana. Here you can see a cover of a book which is the collection of papers from a conference that we organized, our center organized in tribute to Salo Baron in Krakow, Tarnów in Poland back 6 years ago. And this is the volume from that conference edited by our own Hava and Edward Dąbrowa, who was at the time director of Jewish Studies Center in Krakow. So without further ado, Salo Baron's name has been brought up in this webinar a couple of times already, and not by accident. He is for sure the father, or maybe the great-grandfather of social Jewish history. I think that we all, Jewish historians, are his intellectual descendants. And many of us follow Salo Baron's lead in resisting, or at least problematizing, to use academic jargon, the so-called lachrymose conception of Jewish history. And here, or in other words, a sorrowful, a tearful version or notion of Jewish history, of continuing suffering, anti-Semitism, violence, and persecution. And here you can read Salo Baron's own words: all my life I have been struggling against the hitherto dominant lachrymose conception of Jewish history, because I have felt that an overemphasis on Jewish suffering distorted the total picture of a Jewish historic evolution. So Baron suggested, as another preeminent historian of early modern East European Jewish history, Adam Teller, paraphrased, and I quote, that Jewish history should not be seen simply as a series of persecutions, but rather as a process of ongoing engagement between the Jews and their surroundings. And my colleague Stan Mervis has already alluded to this approach in his discussion of subalternity in the pre-modern period. It seems that as another preeminent historian of modern history, David Engel, as he pointed out, Salo Baron, when he thought about Lacrymos's conception of Jewish history, he mainly thought about the pre-modern period or pre-French Revolutionary period when he articulated his stance. But it so happened that it us, historians of modern Jewish experience, the subject of today's webinar, that we have been actually the most enthusiastic followers of the Baronian school of history. I myself come from that lineage. My mentor, Todd Endelman, was a student of Yosef Yerushalmi, who in turn was a student of Salo Baron. So I was taught in grad school that to look beyond violence, to use Baron's own words, beyond extraordinary events. Baron believed that events like pogroms, riots, etc., are extraordinary and they were exception in Jewish history, while the ordinary flow of life was the norm. So these extraordinary events should not obscure the ordinary flow of life. So in this short talk, I would like to talk about the last 20 years as a period of rethinking of Baronian anti-Lacrymos position in modern Jewish history, and especially in its East European and Polish aspects. And on those I would like to focus here. But before I do that, since the webinar is devoted to modern period, I thought that I would clarify what I mean by the modern period, what we mean by the modern period. And this is not an easy clarification. A long time ago, Michael Mayer wrote a famous article, Where Does the Modern Period of Jewish History Begin? And he laid out 100 years of propositions of this chronology, right? What is modern history and when does it begin? So maybe 1660s with Sabbatianism and Hasidism, perhaps 1700 with national reawakening, 1940s, the beginning of enlightened state reforms, maybe 1770s with Moses Mendelssohn and Haskalah, Jewish Enlightenment, 1780s, 90s, French Revolution, right? Political emancipation. And these propositions came from the greats of Jewish history, people like Gretz and Yost and Dubnov and others. So where do all these dates come from? From major question, right? So we ask, when did the modern transformations or modernization, when did this become normative in Jewish history? And by modern transformation, we mean new forms of government, new ideologies, new modes of production, new Jewish self-organization and self-identification, etc. And as you can guess, there is no clear-cut answer to that. And we still argue about when modern period began. For example, in Eastern Europe, my field of expertise, the periodization is very different than in the so-called West. So pinpointing it is bound to fail, and that's what Michael Mayer actually suggested. For this talk, I'm going to take the most non-controversial period in the modern history, and that is 20th century. In Eastern Europe, mainly Soviet Union and Poland. So I would like to suggest here, and this is sort of the frame of my discussion, I would like to suggest that in the last 20 years or so, or maybe longer, there has been an ongoing tension, very creative, very productive tension in East European and Polish Jewish historiography, which sort of propelled a lot of exciting works, a lot of interesting rethinking of modern East European history. And that's really, and this tension centers around Baronian, I think, centers around Baronian lachrymose conception of history. So all these years, historians have continued to write against the preconception of Eastern Europe and Poland as this land of never-ending oppression, persecution, violence, anti-Semitism, primitive anti-Semitism, right? And moving toward the focus on Baron's ordinary flow of life. So this is sort of one side of that story. But at the same time, we have seen more and more scholarship that focuses on violence, but complicates our understanding of that violence. This scholarship points that violence cannot be limited to those extraordinary events, quote unquote. This is not pogrom. Yes, pogrom lasts a day, a few hours, maybe a couple of days, but it has a long-lasting consequences that we only now start to unpack, consequences and meanings. And I will give you some examples of works that take that on. So example one, I have two examples: Soviet Union, Soviet history, Soviet Jewish history, and post-war Polish Jewish history. So with a Soviet Union, the case of Soviet Union is an excellent example of history that has been narrated as a good kind of history, as sort of Jewish history that was not an ongoing series of suffering. So for years, historians focused on the good, right? On balance, the Soviet Union was good for the Jews, they argued. Lenin unequivocally condemned anti-Semitism as the dark legacy of Tsarist regime. Anti-Jewish violence was strictly penalized for at least a few years. It changed over time, and that was in contrast to interwar Poland. Soviet Union, Soviet regime offered civil and political rights, including access to jobs and education unseen, again, in a bad guy in interwar Poland. Soviet Jewish Yiddish culture thrived for much of the interwar period. Assimilation or Sovietization, becoming Soviet, was galloping. So was modernization of Jewish life for much of the interwar period. And here I would like to show you some examples, some wonderful works. And this is the generation, the younger generation of historians born in 70s, Anna Sternschiss, Elisa Bemporat, sadly late David Schneer. They wrote some incredible works precisely about that, about the good of the becoming, the Soviet Jewry, the sort of positive history, the thriving Jewish culture, assimilation, acculturation, all these phenomena. But also recently, actually throughout the last 20, 30 years, throughout the Soviet Jewish historiography, we've been very much aware of the but, right? That this is not just all a great story. Jewish religious communities were obviously victimized by the Soviet campaigns against all religions. Jews became victims of the great Purges as cosmopolitan traitors. We all know about the doctor's plot of 1953. This is a known story, but at the same time, there's been a sort of belief that between Mendel Bailey's trial, a ritual murder trial of 1913, and the doctor's plot of 1953, there were Soviet Jewish history was more or less devoid of major major anti-Semitism and violence, pogroms, riots, right? What you saw in interwar Poland and wartime Poland. So now we actually have a new turn, I think, a new turn in that historiography, which shows that not so fast. Anti-Semitism of ordinary neighbors did not disappear, but continue throughout the period. And here, one of the most important works is my friend Elisa Bemporat, new work on the legacy of the 1918 and 1919 pogroms in the Soviet Union. A legacy of blood, Jews, pogroms, ritual murder in the lands of the Soviets. And she argues in that the myth of the absence of pogroms and anti-Semitism under the Soviets was precisely that. It was the myth. It was the founding myth of Soviet Jewry. In reality, blood libel and ritual murder accusations persisted and merged with a myth of Judeo-Bolshevism throughout the interwar, wartime, and post-war period, culminating in the Doctor's Plot 1953. So Doctor's Plot was not extraordinary. It was part of a long-lasting process. Before, when I mentioned that Bailey's trial 1913 was the last moment, no, the pogroms of 1918, 1919, that was seen for many years in historiography as the last outbreak of anti-Jewish Jewish violence in the Soviet Union. But as Bemporat shows, it was not so. Bemporat's book is a part of a new exciting outpour of works on pogroms and anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, more generally. When I worked on the pogrom in Krakow back 20 years ago, there was hardly such an exciting historiography emerging. Today, I think we see a real return, if you will, to the study of anti-Jewish violence, but in ways which are truly exciting, theoretically, methodologically. So, for example, so we don't ask only what causes violence, what triggers violence. We now ask about the meanings, the cultural, anthropological meanings of violence. So, for example, William Hagen, in his recent book on anti-Jewish violence in Poland during and after the First World War, he shows these pogroms as an example of carnivalesque, symbolic violence, which was often accompanied by dance and music, in which local perpetrators used violence to restore a social order, a righteous social order from before the war. They wanted to penalize the perceived offenders, and in doing so, they believed that they were redeeming their own communities. And you can see other fantastic books. Eugene Avrutin, among others, edited a new important volume on ritual murder in Eastern Europe and beyond, and Russia. Steven Zipperstein, of course, wrote another path-breaking study on Kishinev and the cultural meanings of that pogrom. There are a couple of works in Polish. Artur Markowski wrote an important book about pogrom in Białystok in 1906. And the last book here, this is one of 4 volumes devoted to the pogroms to the history of pogroms in Polish territories. And finally, and this is, I have, I think, 3 more minutes, I would like to spend them saying, we can talk more in question and answer Q&A session about post-war Poland, right? So here again, you see that tension. ordinary flow of life versus more focus on violence. So here again, for years and years, the historiography focused on violence. Right? That post-war Poland was the land of anti-Jewish pogroms and then mass immigration. And this is true. Violence, anti-Jewish violence in particular, and violence in general, was omnipresent in post-war Poland. Mass immigration of 100,000 Jews did follow, and this is beyond the doubt. This is another historical fact. And actually, we have some wonderful, let me just quickly show you some. Here I need to plug my own work. So here are some works on violence in post-war Poland. Most importantly, of course, Jan Tomasz Gross. This is the defining volume, Fear, Anti-Semitism in Poland After Auschwitz. You have another book by Joanna Tokarska-Bakir on the right, which just came out 2 years ago, which is an incredible anthropology of pogrom in Kielce in 1946, in which more than 40 Jewish survivors were killed. She really shows who the perpetrators of that violence were. She shows them as having first-hand experience in murdering and denouncing Jews during the war in Poland, right? So these are some very important works. And but at the same time, there is more and more work showing that focus on violence and immigration distorts post-war Jewish history. It reproduces this lachrymose conception of it. It reduces the diversity and multiplicity of Jewish experience to only one aspect. It disregards all other Jewish identities that are not of the victim or an immigrant, obscures multiple ways in which Jews and non-Jews encountered each other in post-war Poland, and it obscures the fact that 100,000 Jews lived in Poland after the 1950s in Lower Silesia, Szczecin, Łódź. And here again, and this is my final, here are the words that I think nicely resolve the tension. So I think that these publications that you can see in front of you, and this is again younger generation of scholars, we resolve the tension between the lachrymose and anti-lachrymose perspective by focusing and analyzing the suffering and the consequences and the meanings of violence against survivors. So they go beyond extraordinary events, while at the same time focusing on survivors' everyday lives. Again, following Baronian ordinary flow of life, right? Daily struggles, memories, choices. And all these books, I think, do so in rich cultural comparative microhistories. Thank you so much. That's all I have. I will be very happy to answer your questions in the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Tirosh-Samuelson. We're going to move now from Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union and Poland to Germany. And Professor Benkert, the stage is yours.
All right. Yeah, thank you very much. This was exciting, and I think there's a lot of things that I can talk about that will resonate with what Anya talked about. So I have kind of 5 points. So my more recent research focuses on space, and I think if we're talking about Jews in modern and contemporary Europe, particularly Germany, what I'm going to talk about, then I think that many of these changes that are obvious and the ruptures of violence, but also the kind of continuities are reflected in spaces. And looking at spaces helps us to understand these ruptures, but also integrate them, as Anya might agree, in the kind of flow of life after the Holocaust. So I want to do 5 things. First, I'm going to answer why space and why space is important to study as a lens through which to look at Jewish life. I'm going to talk about Jewish spaces in the 19th and 20th century. Of course, the destruction of those spaces, what happened to these spaces after 1945, and then the debates about what can be, how Jewish life life in Germany can be represented at those spaces today. I'm focusing on synagogues. There are many other Jewish spaces that I could be focusing on, but for the sake of time, today we're just going to talk about synagogues. So why spaces? And here I'm following an idea by Simone Lessig and Miriam Rurup. And they were arguing that Jews in the early modern period were a distinct social group primarily defined by religion, religious law, language, and discrimination. And of course, that also has a spatial element to this, because in this sense, this confinement, this discrimination has an expression in space. And that is, of course, the infamous Judengasse. And I'm looking here at this plan of my hometown, Frankfurt, from the early 17th century. And the Judengasse is precisely here where I marked, or on this larger map down here. It's the same map, just a little bit larger here. And it is outside the medieval wall. It's a confinement, it's a designated space, and it is disprivileged because it's beyond the wall. Of course, this map is younger. It's from the early 17th century. So the city had grown beyond that. So the new fortifications are seen here, of course. But this is roughly the medieval city, and the Jewish lane is clearly outside. You can also see that the parcels of land in the Judengasse, the Jewish lane, are much smaller than in the surrounding non-Jewish parts of town within the walls. So in pre-modern times, Jews are a distinct social group, marked in part also by discrimination and violence. And that is marked spatially by the Judengasse. However, of course, as Anya already mentioned, right, Enlightenment and the French Revolution, and for Germany particularly, the French Revolution comes to Germany through French troops. This has inherently kind of universalist tendencies that open a space for Jews towards emancipation, towards kind of a middle class idea of existence as intellectuals, as merchants, as artisans. And that, of course, raises questions on the particularity of a religious group in a system that is moving towards a kind of a universal idea of citizenship. So this too, of course, is then reflected in space, because Jewish spaces, the Judengasse, cease to exist, and a whole lot of other Jewish spaces spring up.
Volker, you are frozen.
Okay.
Okay, now you're back with us. All right, good, thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I apologize for the technical problem here, but the point that I'm trying to make is that Jewish spaces are kind of reflective of Jewish life, and with emancipation, of course, the Judengasse kind of ceases to exist. But in the 19th century, when a whole lot of new Jewish spaces spring up, then initially they are very much still near the old Judengasse, the Jewish ghetto, if you will, but later synagogues spring up all over town. So in Germany, in Frankfurt, for example, my hometown, the older synagogues are near the Judengasse, but a new synagogue built in the beginning of the 20th century, and the then very, very famous and desired Art Deco style was built on right across the entire city in a very, very new, modern part. The Jewish community grew so much that yet another synagogue was built on Friedberger Anlage, yet and again in another part of town around the same period. So what I'm trying to say is, right, the spatial confines of Jews in pre-modern times around the Judengasse, with the emancipation, right, this has a spatial aspect to it too, and that is that Jewish spaces spring up all over town, as exemplified by these two very, very prestigious, very large synagogues built here in Frankfurt. Of these four large synagogues, only the one in the West End, on the upper left corner, survived. The others are fully destroyed, mostly in Kristallnacht. One is a particularly problematic space because after the synagogue on Friedberger Anlage was destroyed, Frankfurt built an air raid bunker there, and that air raid bunker is so it cannot be destroyed without razing the city, basically. So it is still there, and it is now a kind of a commemorative space of the Jewish synagogue that was there. But it is also a bunker, so it is also reflective of Frankfurt during World War II. So Frankfurt is no exception to that. New Jewish spaces spring up all over towns in Germany. And very often these spaces are kind of try to blend in to existing architectural styles. So for example, this synagogue here in Cologne is very reminiscent of a neo-Romanesque style. Cologne is of course famous for its Gothic cathedral, but probably lesser known is that there are 7 Romanesque churches grouped around that cathedral. Those are among the oldest churches in Germany. And it's not surprising that the very reform-oriented community here chose a Romanesque style for its, or neo-Romanesque style for its synagogue, to really show that kind of integration into German society. Others follow suit. This is a synagogue in Hamburg, built around the same time, also neo-Romanesque, in the same or in a similar style. Yet others, however, were conceived in what was at the time called a kind of Orientalist or Moorish style. For example, this one here in Königsberg, Kaliningrad today. And that doesn't mean that these communities weren't reform, but it just means that there's a different approach of what it means to be German and Jewish, with a somewhat more distinct identity, different from those who have a more kind of a culturist identity. The biggest question was whether or not they would have an organ. Many communities split over that question. So that a synagogue would look like a church, that was okay, but that it would also sound like a church. There were lots of people who parted ways on that. So what does that mean now? We have, I showed that Jewish spaces are, with the emancipation, are now outside of these confined spaces of the Judengasse. They spring up, they take on at times architectural styles around them. So how should we make sense of that? And again, I'm borrowing from Simone Lessig and Miriam Rürup, but if we understand space as a metaphor of social position, then right, these buildings are a reflection of how these communities saw each other. But they're also a space of kind of an imaginary superstratum, as they call it. It's not only how these communities wanted to be seen, but also what the surrounding ascribed to them and how they would like to see themselves in the future and how this connects to the past. So many synagogues, for example, this one here in the famous one in Berlin and Oranienburger Straße, was a kind of a repudiation of earlier buildings, a much, much more prestigious, prominent, proud building than previous Berlin synagogues. And though buildings, of course, suggest by the very materials that they're built in, stone and iron, that they're kind of static and permanent, we know they're not. Buildings get torn down all the time. And of course, particularly the ruptures of 20th century Germany means that architectures change dramatically. So they communicate a sense of permanence and often a sense of pride and belonging, but we know that this is all too quickly betrayed in the Holocaust. And spaces are always kind of areas of communication, right? Yes, it's a boundary, it's a building for a community, but it is also communicating something to those around them. And it is often a place of contact, right? There's a community center around it. There's a shop or a restaurant around it that are kind of dialogical spaces where communication happens. So if we look at Jewish spaces in this sense, right, then the destruction of these Jewish spaces is particularly heinous, because it really means the end of all of these imaginations, of this creativity, of what Jewish life in Germany could be like. And yes, the destruction of Jewish spaces is mostly associated with Kristallnacht, right? When the synagogues and shops and businesses and apartments, houses were set on fire. But this is not the only wave of destruction that Jewish spaces had to endure. The bombs of World War II were indiscriminate and also destroyed whatever was left of Jewish spaces. And post-war reconstruction also did its part, because here too, in the new mantra of the city made for cars, many spaces, especially Jewish spaces, were removed. So after 1945, there's a clear delay and no restitution of these spaces to communities of survivors who are reluctant to return to the country of the perpetrators. Others had laid claim to these spaces, and only reluctantly were memorial spaces built, but often without returning the actual property to its Jewish owners. So what does that mean for today? So I want to put you in front of a case that is very controversial in Germany today. One of the synagogues we saw earlier, the Bornplatz synagogue in Hamburg, that was completely destroyed by the Nazis. The community was then even forced to pay for the removal of the ruins. There's not a stone left of this building. There's now an initiative to rebuild that synagogue as it was. So on top, you can see what it looked like. It was built at the beginning of the 20th century. Then in the middle, there's a reconstruction or a projection of what it will look like once restored today. And on the bottom, you can see the memorial that is there in place today that just retraces the outline of the building. It's very subtle. You can see there's a bike rider crossing that square, and you might not notice what the lines in the pavement actually mean unless you have the kind of vision from above that we now have. So if we follow Lessig and Rürup's ideas about Jewish spaces and discuss that for this proposal, right? Should this building be restored in its original form? Think about this idea of a metaphor of social position. The planners, those in favor of the synagogue, say Jewish life in Germany is growing. Building a synagogue accommodates this need and communicates that Jewish life is flourishing. The critics, many of whom are scholars, and a whole group of Israeli scholars who were particularly critical of this endeavor, say that Jewish life in Germany today is tied to migration and has little to do with the German Jewish community that had built this synagogue in the beginning of the 20th century. That's true, of course. Many German Jews today are not descendants of those who lived in Germany in the beginning of the 20th century, but they are more recent immigrants from the former Soviet Union who came to Germany, particularly in the 1990s. If we think about what is this, and is this an imaginary space of the past and present, the planners are arguing that Jewish life should be in the center of the city, where it was. Rebuilding is the best answer to current anti-Semitism. And of course, this debate centers around the attack on the synagogue in Halle recently. But the critics argue, well, if that's the imagination of the past, then you're just trying to gloss over the history. You're glossing over the Holocaust. You're pretending as if nothing has happened. And you're pretending as if there was no current anti-Semitism because you're just rebuilding as it was. Space is not static. The planners are arguing that restoring Jewish life at its former space is possible, right? We can go back to what it was before. The critics say there is already a memorial that should not be disturbed, right? This memorial has its own history, and as such, we should not disturb it. So why should we rebuild something that is gone? And then the idea of boundaries, communication, and contact. The planners argue the memorial is too subtle. It doesn't really communicate well what this means. It's not an adequate representation. But the critics would argue communication with non-Jews should be on an equal playing field, not on a reconstruction of something that feels familiar to non-Jews. So the arguments here, and I'm neither arguing before or against the reconstruction of this argument, but it shows that space matters in determining what Jewish life in Germany is and can be. And this falls, of course, squarely into a debate right now in Germany where lots of spaces are reconstructed that are lost in the war. We just rebuilt the Imperial Palace in Berlin, and in order to do that, we tore down an East German Palace of the Republic. We rebuilt the Frauenkirche in Dresden, or in my hometown in Frankfurt, we rebuilt the entire old city. When I go to Frankfurt, I don't find my way around it anymore because it's a new town that just happens to look like the old one. So there's a whole sense of this kind of restructuring. But there's also Jewish buildings that rather stress rupture. So the main synagogue in Munich, for example, built in 2003, is reminiscent of the Wailing Wall, and with a very, very kind of modernist architecture on top. It doesn't try to reconstruct the old synagogue, and the same in Dresden. Daniel Liebeskind's Jewish Museum in Berlin even more stresses rupture by this architecture of a broken Star of David. So all of this is very, very, very difficult. I'm not making an argument for or against the reconstruction of the synagogue. The argument that I'm making is that space is indeed a reflection of what Jewish life can be, and it has been in very, very profound ways since emancipation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Volker. This was fascinating. And we are going to go right away to our third presentation by Professor Mervis, who will take us across the pond, so to speak, and let's listen to Jewish-Black relations in America.
Oh, okay, there we go. Let me just share my screen. And let me just thank Anya and Volker for really great talks just now. Okay, so let's get this going.
Stanley, we need you to speak up a little bit louder.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Do you hear me well?
Not so great.
Okay, let me, sorry, let me just see if I can get the, okay. Okay, can you hear me better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. All right. So I was thinking that, especially in the moment that we're living in right now, today, that it makes sense to address how Jewish studies can contribute to our lives today, how Jewish studies can, what there is to learn. And I'll speak a little bit about some historiography at the end, but I really just also want to lay out some of the tensions that are inherent in the very complicated relationship between Jews and Blacks in the United States. And I think that, especially with the Derek Chauvin verdict just now, that this is a especially critical discussion. But let me take you back to the 19th century and mention the Jewish involvement and approach to slavery in the United States. There was an estimated 25,000 Jewish supporters of the Confederacy. And those included people like Judah P. Benjamin, who was the Attorney General and other things of the Confederacy, and David Levi Yulee, who was a senatorial representative from Florida, who was the first Jew in the United States Senate, was a Confederate sympathizer. And he left the United States Senate over his protest for the Union. This was, people recognized Jewish political figures as being associated with the Confederacy. And I know that's hard for us to sort of, to accept today, but that's a part of the reality of Jewish life then. By the way, both those characters, David Levi Yulee and Judah P. Benjamin, were both from St. Thomas in the Caribbean. So there was a strong pro-slavery sentiment, especially among the traditionalist rabbinate in the United States at the time. Famously, Rabbi Morris Rafal, who was one of the few yeshiva-trained rabbinic figures in the United States at the time, who was serving in New York. He was the first rabbi to ever deliver the congressional invocation. And so he was a major public figure. And on January 4th, 1861, in a national fast for the Civil War, he made a speech where he defended the practice of slavery because it was a biblical institution. So who are we to abolish slavery, which is something that's sanctioned by the Bible? And that's the sentiment of the traditionalist rabbinate, Morris Rafal. Similarly, Isaac Mayer Wise, who was probably the most famous rabbinic authority in the Americas in the 19th century. He was the first president and founder of HUC in Cincinnati, Hebrew Union College, and a towering figure in American Jewish history. His approach was somewhat more ambivalent. He published a editorial in a magazine called The Israelite in 1863, where he sanctioned the use of slavery. Now, he said that slavery shouldn't be carried into the new Western territories, but that slavery was something that was okay by biblical standards. And who are we to object to that? Now, he had another objection too, and that was against the abolitionists. William Lloyd Garrison had uttered very acerbic anti-Semitic remarks. He called Jews monsters at one point. And that was a common sentiment among abolitionists. So he felt alienated from abolitionism, and that also helped to inform his defense of slavery in the South. Now, there were anti-slavery rabbinic figures during the Civil War. Most famously, David Einhorn, who was a major figure in Reform Judaism in Germany, who had been a participant in the synods in 1840, 1844, and 45. He had been involved in the Tikhtin controversy with Abraham Geiger. So among the real early leadership of Reform Judaism, and in Baltimore, he gave a speech and he said, "It is a rebellion against God to enslave human beings." That's in period. Now, Baltimore, a very southern city, people didn't appreciate his remarks, and he was run out of town. He had to escape Baltimore, pick up in the middle of the night, literally, and remove his family to the north because of his support of abolitionism. And in another case, inspired by David Einhorn's strong stance, a Reform rabbinic personality in Chicago, Bernard Felsenthal, also began to offer anti-slavery sermons. So I think it's fair to say that the rabbinate, at least, not to say the Jewish population as a whole, since it was very much divided from South and North, had a relatively unfixed position when it came to slavery and abolition. Now, as we move a little bit forward in time into the early 20th century, now we can start to talk about alliances, and sometimes those alliances between Jews and Blacks come with certain tensions. So as a product of the Great Migration, and that is the uprooting of Black people from the South en masse to the northern cities like Cleveland and Chicago and Cleveland and Columbus, there was the Jews were coming to the same cities around the same time, and where Black people could reside in expanding cities, all the more so could Jews reside. So residency restrictions affected both Jews and Blacks. Some neighborhoods that we even associate as being almost exclusively Jewish today, like Riverdale in the Bronx, had quotas against Jewish settlement. And if Black people could settle, then Jews could settle. And so this was something that brought Jews and Blacks together, shared residency, shared space. Jews and Blacks simply lived together in Harlem and in other parts of the United States, especially in the Midwest. And but this also bred some tensions, because who were the renters and who were the landlords? Naturally, the Jews, who were more upwardly mobile, became the pawnbrokers, became the landlords. A really famous sentiment was expressed by Langston Hughes, the Renaissance, the Harlem Renaissance era poet, who published a collection of poetry called "Fine Clothes to the Jew," in which he expresses this kind of animosity that when you have to pawn your clothes, who are you pawning it to? The Jew, because the Jew lives in your neighborhood and he owns the pawn shop. James Baldwin, the famous Black novelist, writes in no uncertain terms, "In Harlem, our landlords were Jews and we hated them." He goes on to say, not because they were Jews, but because they were bad landlords. And if you lived in New York, you can maybe sympathize with that sentiment. Now, this gave way to some political alliances, especially through the American Jewish Congress, which was an advocacy group that was devoted to supporting Eastern European migration to the United States at the exclusion of German migration, who had their own association. So they tried to promote race relations within the urban spaces in which Jews and Black people lived, and they also formed an alliance, official alliance, with the emerging NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. In fact, the very first vice president of the NAACP, in partnership with W.E.B. Du Bois, was Arthur Spingard, who was who you see in this picture here, receiving a check from Jackie Robinson, our favorite person. So he and it wasn't just Jewish support of the NAACP. The civil rights judge, a Black man, Hubert Delaney, always and consistently took up causes that he felt were discriminatory against Jews, under the principle that things that discriminate against Jews will discriminate against Blacks. Louis Brandeis, the Supreme Court Justice, would take cases of the NAACP for free. He would do it pro bono. And in the Black press of the era in the early 20th century, you see a very common feature in which they report on the pogroms that were from Kishinev on, as Anya had spoken about. And they always refer to those pogroms as being lynchings. So they they paint the Jewish experience within their own experience. And I think that that's a powerful point of convergence. In fact, W.E.B. Du Bois, who traveled to Eastern Europe, he described the pogroms as an attack on civilization comparably only to such horrors as the Spanish Inquisition and the African slave trade, again, making this association. Now, I just want to take a minute to appreciate some of the more ambivalent, ambiguous elements to Jewish and Black relations. This is, as you all know, Al Jolson. Now, Al Jolson was a minstrel singer in the vaudeville. He was probably the most famous singer in America in the 1920s. I think that's a safe assumption, and probably the most famous Jew. Famously, in The Jazz Singer, he plays a Jewish role in 1927. But he was famous. He is the one he had invented, but he popularized blackface in his minstrel performances, in which several performers playing banjos would sing Black songs. And that was because Blacks couldn't be leading acts in vaudeville. And so in a way, it's a very complicated situation, because it was a way of kind of celebrating Black culture, but in a way that was extremely denigrating to Black culture. In the 1920s, this blackface had a little bit of a different resonance than it does today. And it's good that it does, it's good that today we have no tolerance for it. I think that we have to look at Al Jolson somewhat differently. But still, it's a kind of co-option of Black culture. And there lies the some of the complexity of this issue. Another good example of this is George Gershwin, who wrote Porgy and Bess, an opera for Black singers. Again, it's a Jew telling the story of Black actors. And in that, there's almost like an elbowing out of the Black voice from their own experience. And that's the criticism of George Gershwin. But again, like Isaac Mendez-Belisario in Jamaica or Al Jolson, it was meant as a celebration of Jewish culture, not a kind of cultural appropriation, but that's what it would be for us. And it goes the other way too. So Paul Robeson, the great singer and actor and football star, and a man that spoke 12 languages, who had a PhD, who was an absolute a wonder of a human being, and he traveled the globe. And he was a profound advocate for civil rights and for the empowerment of Black people. And he really found a powerful connection to the Jewish experience. He traveled to Tsarist Russia, and he began to sing songs in Yiddish. So you could go to YouTube and type in Paul Robeson singing in Yiddish. And it's an amazing experience. You'll thank me for having done it. And he did this by way of solidarity with the Jewish experience. You see Louis Armstrong also articulating similar sentiments. So some kind of like a bizarre philo-Semitism, where Louis Armstrong said he only likes Jews, and everyone should love the Jews because they're the most honest. And so it's going to another extreme and another kind of fetishization in a way. All right, so not a great picture. I mean, the content of the picture is great, but the image itself is a little bit blurry. But what you're seeing here is, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King with one of the greatest rabbinic luminaries in American Jewish history, Avraham Joshua Heschel. And so Jews naturally poured themselves into the civil rights movement. And I think that that is a trend, that Jews were connected with the civil rights in the 1960s. Joachim Prinz, who is a German rabbi serving in America, he addressed he was one of the people that gave a speech on the March in Washington in 1963, and I'll read you an excerpt from that speech. Joachim Prinz says, "We share the profound concern of millions of people about the shame and disgrace of inequality and injustice, which make a mockery of the great American idea. America must not remain silent. not merely Black America, but all of America. It must speak up and act, from the president down to the humblest of us, and not for the sake of the Negro, not for the sake of the Black community, but for the sake of the image, the idea, and the aspiration of America itself. And that's a powerful sentiment that we all probably need to hear right now. Famously, Avraham Joshua Heschel, who was a visionary and really reinvented Jewish religion in a lot of ways as a kind of passionate exchange between God and man, that God needs man and passionately wants to be with man, a kind of ecstatic Jewish experience that he wrote about, one that's connected to Jewish time and to the Jewish rhythms of life. And that's the essence of Judaism, is in its sanctification of time. So a revolutionary thinker for the Jewish life. He became friends with Martin Luther King in 1963 when he delivered his very famous, you can see it online, religion and race speech. And then, of course, famously, in a famous image, he joined hands together with Martin Luther King and others in the March on Selma in 1965. And somebody who's very important to me and to Chava, Jack Rothschild, made an appeal to Southern Jewry in Atlanta to try to lift themselves out of their heritage of racism and to make a connection with the civil rights movement. And in a personal dimension to that, my grandfather, who I was named after, was in that congregation and knew Jack Rothschild, and he had the first, or one of the first, integrated scout troops in Georgia. So it's a very representative of the kind of mission that Jack Rothschild was trying to promote in Atlanta. Now, let me just quickly run through this, because I think that this is just amazing. Jewish producers and Black music, the two go together, and and Black music is very much connected to the vision of Jewish producers and recorders who and engineers who wanted to make this music be heard. And I'm just going to give you some examples quickly. Norman Granz, and you can see the list here. Obviously, he was a New York jazz promoter. And Leonard Chess from Chess Records, so, Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters, Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley. Art Rupe, Specialty Records, Fat Domino, Lloyd Price, Little Richard. Sid Nathan, who is always described as kind of an overweight schlub, but he produced Bull Moose Jackson, Errol Bostic, Little Willie John, and James Brown. And probably the most famous of them all, Jerry Wexler, who was the one that recorded Ray Charles, Otis Redding, and really, famously Aretha Franklin. And when you hear Aretha Franklin speak about her relationship to Jerry Wexler, she speaks of him as if he was a father, and she speaks of him in such adoring and affectionate terms. And so the thing about the Jewish music producers is they're so interconnected and interwoven with Black experience. But where does solidarity and support become exploitation? Who is profiting off of this music? I guarantee it was the Jewish music producers were profiteering more than the Black artists were. And so there was also an element of co-option here. But where does support and where does exploitation begin and support end? Okay, now I want to talk about the rapid deterioration of the Jewish-Black relations as we move into the 1980s and 1990s. The 1967 war, the Six-Day War in Israel, really changed the picture, the landscape for Jews in America. I would say almost unanimously, the Black position in the United States, of course, with some exceptions, tended to find solace and find solidarity in the relation and the experience of the Palestinians and their experience of being colonized. And so there was a natural sense of unity in that. So Jews responded with racism. Sam Maisel, who ran for mayor against a Black incumbent in 1973 in Atlanta, Georgia, ran on pretty much a racist platform. Another example is the Carter administration had to remove their U.S. ambassador to the UN, a Black man, because he had met with the PLO. And so this was upsetting to Jewish voters and also represented a kind of Black interest to associate with the Palestinian cause. There was a great escalation in the 1980s in New York when Jesse Jackson ran for president. He called New York Jaime Town. Okay, so that's pretty anti-Semitic. It's about anti-Semitic as it gets. And he was very angry that the reporter published it and he denied it. But he had used the term Jaime several times. And but here's the thing: when Ed Koch reacted, and he said no Jew in their right mind would vote for him, he used very strong racist reactionary language. So this is a two-way street here. It's not just the rise in Black anti-Semitism, but of Jewish racism. This, it becomes very aggressive in as the Nation of Islam begins to assert that Jews were a dominant force in the slave trade, and that upsets university systems. It infiltrates the universities, where what should have been a free space became one of hostility. The Jews respond by becoming much more conservative, and also politicizing AIPAC, which had formed as an apolitical party, but during the 1980s and 1990s had become clearly a conservative movement, and they did this often against the interests of the Black community. And the Crown Heights riot was a major culmination. Now, this wasn't an American, this isn't a African American and Jewish tension. It's a Chabad and West Indian tension. The West Indians that lived in Crown Heights in the 1990s, when a member of the Rebbe's convoy hit a Black child and kept on driving, and then that sparked riots, and there was racial tensions. It was spurred on by Dinkins, who some have suggested that Dinkins could have done more to stop it and didn't. And so this was maybe the culmination of a tension that was brewing now for 2 decades. Okay, I'm wrapping up here quickly, and I just wanted to give you some sense of the historiography. Now, there's many, many more works than this. I think this provides a nice little continuity. In 1995, Hasia Diner wrote In the Almost Promised Land, and in that book, you get this sense of alliance, of Jewish and Black solidarity in the formation of the NAACP, W.B. Du Bois, and that's a kind of a triumphal narrative of Jewish and Black relations. And then it gets more nuanced. And so someone who spoke for Jewish studies not long ago here, Cheryl Lynn Greenberg, in Troubling the Waters, you get a much more nuanced picture where she argues that it's actually contingent. There is no one nature to the Jewish and Black relationship as being positive or being hostile. It's all situational, right? And it's all contextual. And that was her point, I think, in opposition to the kind of triumphal narrative of Hasia Diner. And then in 2018, in a methodology that I myself am working with in my own work, you get a much more nuanced perspective by Mark Gollinger in Black Power in Jewish Politics, where he argues that, the parties were being pushed apart in the 1960s over radicalism, but that helped to coalesce a Jewish political ideology, to coalesce American Zionism, American Jewish ethnic identity. And so the Black Panther and the Black nationalist movement worked together as a kind of catalyst for Jewish nationalism. And so it's not just about opposition. And I think that that's a really important point. And I'm trying to make a similar argument myself in Jamaica. And I'll just end with this wonderful slide, because I talked about such negative things. I wanted to show some nice things, like the CCNY Beavers from 1944 to 1949 were the first integrated basketball teams, or the Neil Brenner and Dave Chappelle, who were writers for the Chappelle Show, who were probably one of the most prophetic and important political voices in the United States in the 1990s. And also the works of Mel Brooks, who saw or idealized a partnership between Jews and Blacks. That was when he lampooned and criticized the absurdity of racism in his Blazing Saddles. Right, the story centers around this friendship between a Jewish and a Black character. So I think these are points of kind of collaboration, and where Jews and and Blacks kind of come together in the United States. So I will thank you very much for your attention, and I give it over to Chava.
Great, thank you. This is absolutely fascinating, and it's a wonderful complement to the two European presentations. So, Lisa, if there are questions already available, we'll start. If not, I can pose one question to get us off.
Please ask your question.
Okay, so I would like to ask all three of you, what are the major challenges that you face in understanding the modern and contemporary Jewish social history? Anya already mentioned one issue, of course, the lacrimose issue, but that's only one. So if you are going to identify 2 or 3 obstacles to your work as social historian, what would that be? Whoever would like to start. Is it access? I can give you some ideas. Is it access to primary sources? Well, and sometimes it could be. Is it all sorts of what we call prejudices or all sorts of presumptions about the material? Is it that we don't have enough historical distancing from the material that we're trying to unpack? So what would you say would be challenges to you?
So let me just say a few words. For me right now in my new project on post-war migrations, global migrations of both Jewish families and ethnic Polish families, it seems to me, so my greatest challenge is reading oral history sources. So first-hand accounts, personal stories. For a social historian, to me, they are the windows into daily experiences. Through those personal stories, we might not be able to figure out patterns, but I think we can really learn a lot about lived experiences, how people made decisions, how they made living. What choices did they have? And with these kind of sources, of course, reading them, first of all, oral history, we co-create the sources, right? So being very mindful of that, that the interview that I have with a survivor, by who I am, and I'm not Jewish. So by my identity as a Polish Catholic, my interviewee tells me a story that he or she would not tell to someone else, someone with different identity, of different age, of different gender, etc., etc. So right now, I guess my identity as an ethnic outsider, I would guess, is a major challenge for me. But this is another issue, big issue in Jewish studies in general, right? Mm-hmm. That's my 5 cents.
Okay, well, Volker, would you like to give it a shot?
Oh, it's the same for me, right? I'm German, and who's been living in America now for going on 16 years. So I'm kind of I'm an immigrant. I'm neither here nor there, and that is also part of the reflection of the audience that I write for, but also the sources that I collect. That I'm kind of in between. Germany is dramatically changing in some ways for the good, and others not so much. Right? We have a far right party in parliament. That is a disgrace. And I'm not. I'm very far away. I'm a commentator on this without firsthand knowledge or living in the country. But likewise, I see the United States undergoing changes, many of which I also find very dangerous. We saw this in January, but I'm not part fully of this community. I'm a very welcome guest, and I'm happy to be welcomed in this sense. But unlike my children, I am a guest.
Interesting. All right, Stanley, we need something, we need to uplift this conversation.
Uplifting. I had more time to think about it, so you know, I got an unfair advantage. For me, I think I've got some like a research problem and a more of a theoretical problem. So for me, I really am, as a social historian, I'm very attached to my sources. And you know, my sources tend to be kind of notarial and kind of bland, but I find it very hard to intervene in my own sources, and that's not always what a historian should be doing. A historian has to kind of mediate the past for us, and so I have a tension, kind of, this is just as a researcher, a tension between sort of imposing a theoretical model and finding a balance between theory and social historical content. So that's my challenge. But and specifically with modern Jewish history is I live in the frontiers because I'm in the 18th century. Despite my talk tonight, my work is actually in the 18th century. So am I an early modernist? Am I a modernist? Or am I just an 18th centuryist? Or and I think the 18th century is an amazing and fun time to write about because of the kind of continuities and ruptures that Volker was talking about before, because of the elements of early modernity, the elements of modernity, all of that's in play, and a very complex and hybridized century.
Great. Lisa, do you want to pose a question, or can I go to another direction? Lisa?
Actually, we have one question.
Okay, let's hear.
Okay. This is for Anya. In keeping with the focus on survivors, in Poland today, Jewish Holocaust survivor Gerda Weissman-Klein's book, All But My Life, is on their bestseller list. It's just a statement.
Thank you for this comment. So I think this reflects the great polarization and tension within contemporary Poland, where on the one hand, books like Gerda's book, which was just translated into Polish last year, becomes a best-selling book, while at the same time you have a government which starts to target historians who write about very problematic, very difficult history of a Second World War and the Holocaust in Poland. So I think now Poland is at the moment of battle for the soul of this country. Where are we going to be in 10 years, 20 years from now? At this moment, it doesn't look good, although I'm optimistic. I'm always optimistic, and I can, well, young generation, I hope, will save us. That's what.
Okay, we have another question.
Let's leave it.
On the first presentation, one thing that stuck with me was how German anti-Semitism / pogroms never truly disappeared. They just got co-opted into religious persecution of Jews under the Soviet regime. It is apparent even today that the Russian state relies on anti-Semitism in order to distract away from the systemic corruption inherent to the oligarchy that thrives in the post-Soviet era. Even amongst the American right, there has been an emergence of support for fascistic and dictatorial figures, the likes of Putin, Duarte, Bolsonaro, etc. I was wondering how the panelists think the blood libel and the slander of ritual murder have evolved in the modern day. And he would like to hear from all three of you on that, if possible.
So I just want to, I don't know if I understood correctly, but I just want to note that what was going on in the Soviet Union and in Poland and in Eastern Europe, what we would call roughly anti-Semitism, was not German. Every region, every town, every country has its own very deeply contextualized forms of anti-Jewish rhetoric and practice, right? So And I think I understood what the person who asked the question had in mind, meaning maybe the Second World War or pre-war German anti-Semitism. But we historians of Eastern Europe, we don't look at anti-Jewish violence or anti-Jewish rhetoric in East European history from the German perspective, right? We see it as a phenomenon which has its own very specific local forms, if you will. Yeah, Stanley Volker.
I must have misspoke. He's looking at it from the Russian perspective.
Okay, then I was completely off the point.
Yeah, I think the resurgence of anti-Semitism in Europe is stunning and scary, but it clearly is familiar, right? It is a kind of very racialized, universalizing kind of rhetoric. That is reminiscent of earlier forms of anti-Semitism, but the guises in which it comes are constantly changing, and that makes it so difficult to point it out and speak out against it. And just I know the question wasn't about Germany, but if you permit me a German perspective, right? I mean, we do have a far-right party in parliament. There are very clear anti-Semitic undertones coming from them, but they are constantly changing, sometimes in the guise of criticism of Israel, sometimes in the form of allegedly protecting Jews from immigrants from Muslim countries, which right, brings in a whole new dynamic that is very, very dangerous, right? It's a philo-Semitism that is really just trying to point immigrants as dangerous. So there's a whole lot of tropes that are very, very dangerous. They're morphing constantly. They are brought into play by various players, not just in the far-right party, but in its surroundings. And that makes it very, very difficult. And things have become sayable that just 10 years ago just were not in the realm of things you could say, let alone say in the federal parliament.
And to answer the question about how the blood libel and ritual murder tropes mutate, I would recommend the epilogue, the last chapter of Elisa Bemporat, Legacy of Blood, where she actually looks at the last 20 years in Russia under Putin. And she shows those, she shows in public rhetoric what Putin says, but also his followers. And she pinpoints those moments of where you can see this legacy still alive of blood, thinking of Jews in terms of blood.
I can try to address that question from my play Americanist perspective. And since I'll be representing the American experience here, and I think that one of the big challenges in American Jewish history is the exceptionalism of America. Was America this haven for Jews? Is it all represented in George Washington's speech at Newport, where he said that bigotry here would have no sanction? And it's a much more complicated story. In a way, it doesn't apply anywhere else. In the colonial Americas, Jews had civil liberties in New York and in Maryland, and then they were just in South Carolina, and they were just taken away when people realized that Jews were voting. So Jews were by default given civil liberties, and then they were stripped of them in America. And that's a kind of exceptionalism, but not in the direction that people think of. And America does have its own homegrown anti-Semitism, and that's partially what brought Jews and Blacks together in some ways. That they had a completely unified opposition to the formation of the KKK in the 1920s. And naturally, but strangely enough, someone like Marcus Garvey from Harlem found a shared cause in the KKK because he wanted to assert the Black nationalism similar to a white nationalism, and this also informed a kind of Jewish supremacy. And so this is what Mark Dollinger is kind of talking about. But and also there's continuities of Russian anti-Semitism, if such a thing exists. I mean, I don't know, I leave that to Anya, but like the Protocols of Elders of Zion was published in the Dearborn Independent by Henry Ford. So I mean, I could go on and on about the anti-Semitic moments in America, and there are many. But I think we have to. I just caution us against this American exceptionalism narrative in which America is always this haven for Jews and a model of tolerance.
Great. Lisa, do we have other questions?
Thank you. We do, but it's past 8:30 and we promised to be done by 8:30.
That's
So
okay. We can take at least one more questions and then I'll wrap it up.
Okay. Let's see. Trying to figure out which one to ask. In the history of Poland, in the last century, people have a strong memory of non-Jewish Polish people being very cruel to Jewish Polish citizens, even prior to Hitler. A question for the historian from Poland: can you comment on this, the relationship, and your findings?
Yes, this is the whole night and day ahead of us. We could spend discussing that. Yes, you are absolutely right. So this is the difficult history that I was referring to. So the history in which clearly there was both political, legal, and just social anti-Semitism, very widespread in pre-war Poland, especially in the 1930s, but not limited to the 1930s, even 1920s. And then, of course, during the war, we now know, and we have growing historiography, which shows us beyond any doubt that that large segments of Polish society either were completely silent or actively participated, denounced, or killed their Jewish neighbors. And this historical fact goes against Polish mythology of being a nation of martyrs and heroes, right? Which also has a long history because of a particular history of colonization and persecution, partitions of Poland. This myth has really emerged as one of the most potent, and it's very difficult. It's really difficult now for many Poles to actually admit that the past is much darker and much more difficult. But I think if we don't take this past on, if we don't really address these difficult issues, we will never be able to build a civil society, the real democratic, tolerant society, because these things fester. I mean, the communities, small towns, small villages, still deal with the past, with what happened in their midst 80, 90 years ago. Big problem.
So that kind of leads me to, I guess, the last question to all three of you very shortly. Kind of what you just said, Anya, brings up the question of the function of the Jewish historian, or the function of the historian of the Jewish experience. So if you have kind of two sentences, how would you define or how would you crystallize the function of the historian of the Jewish experience? What is it really about? Or your work, what is ultimately about? Is it about building a civil society? Is it about knowledge for knowledge's sake? Is it about creating a more, I don't know, creating coexistence between Jews and non-Jews? Is it about allowing Jews to recover their own story, their own understanding of the past so they can have a future? What is it ultimately about from your vantage point? Maybe Stanley, we'll start with you.
Okay. Well, like Anya, I also consider myself to be a descendant, an academic descendant of Selah Baroth, who was the teacher of my teacher. He was the teacher of my doctoral advisor, and my other teacher was Elisheva Kalbach, was the student of Yosef Chaim Rashami. So yeah, I think all of us here are in some ways dedicated to the legacy of Selah Baron. So within that shadow, I see my role as trying to see the Jewish experience as a holistic entity that is in constant evolution and in dialogue with outside cultures. That the Jews, wherever they live, are exposed and are exposed to outside trends that informs their own cultural development, and they also influence cultural developments from the outside. Going back to the early modern period from last week, I was thinking about the ghetto in Mantua. I didn't get to talk about it, where like the Jews are in a ghetto, but they are some of the most secular producers in early modern world. It's those ghetto walls and those neighborhoods that Volker was talking about are very permeable. And so I think that the role of the Jewish historian is to see the big picture, to see how Judaism and Jewishness are things that are in evolution, constantly in dialogue with outside forces, and then how that shapes, and then that could help inform how we understand what Jewish identity might be today.
Yes, very nice. Yeah. Any other comment? Volker, would you like to contribute here before we end the conversation?
Yeah, in the same vein as Stan argued, I think thinking about these Jewish spaces, right? This is reflective of Jewish life and Jewish ideas in Germany. And by the way, this year we're celebrating 1,700 years of documented Jewish life in Germany. 1,700 years. But it is also a very German story. What happened to these properties? Have they been? There was a question on restitution. That story isn't always very pretty. Restitution was lacking in many ways. It's a question of memory. How can and should we commemorate these horrors that happened in our midst, and what are the best tools to do so? Should we stress continuity of 1,700 years of Jewish life in Germany, or should we stress the violent ruptures, which clearly some institutions do more, as the Jewish Museum in Berlin, than others, right? So this is a very dialogical history that says a lot about Jews and Jewish life, and it just says just as much about non-Jewish life in Germany.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And Anya, you will have the last word here, and then I will thank our wonderful audience.
I just want to say, for me, coming from Polish Jewish history, which is incredibly difficult, for me, it's all about reconciliation. And I don't think I got into this history for that purpose. And I don't think that there is reconciliation without historical truth. And I think that's why, and historians in Poland are really important. I think much more than here.
Yeah, I appreciate it. All right, so let me thank, on behalf of all of us, let me thank our wonderful panelists, and also thank the audience for being with us for 3 webinars in a row. You can follow us on Facebook. I can't believe that I'm saying that statement, but that is factually true. You can follow us on Facebook, and do look at our activities, which are publicized on the website. Obviously, the school year is about to end next week, and we will start all over again in the fall. So I wish you all a wonderful week and a very well, we can say it's even summer is here. So have a wonderful, pleasant summer as well. And do remember that Jewish studies is about lifelong learning. We are always continuing to learn, to bring in new evidence, to reinterpret, and to re-examine the relationship between the present and the past, so that there will be a future, hopefully a peaceful future. So thank you all and good evening.